Good morning. Good morning. Have I got a mic yet? Good morning. Testing. There we are. I'm live. Good morning, everyone. People are still coming in and finding their seats. This sounds more echoey than it did yesterday. I'm glad that you've come back. I got thinking after yesterday, and I mentioned this to a few people. You know, if you encounter someone who's never flown, never been in a plane, your logical first step would be kind of take them up for a gentle ride, let them get the feel of it, and then land. Instead, I took you up in an F-16 and did barrel rolls. So, sorry for the kind of harsh introduction yesterday, the stretching process. You know, when we just have a week, when I've got a whole semester, I can ease my way into it. But when we've just got a week, we just have to dive in and do the best we can. So thanks for sticking with it. And I think that the curve will not be quite as bad for the rest of the week. We've laid the essential foundation, and so that will help us as we move forward. So let's review just a couple of the things we got yesterday so we have them fresh in our minds. We talked about the importance of the ancient Near East because Israel was part of the ancient Near East. Even though God gave them revelation by which they transcended that cultural river, still they were part of that culture. We talked about accountability to the authors. That we're accountable so that we can receive the authoritative message through those instruments that God has chosen. So accountability is an important part of our stance toward the material that we're trying to interpret. And in that way, we can feel that we're getting the message that God put there. It's not enough to get messages that are of our own design that we just feel excited or inspired about. We want to get God's message. And that means we really have to use the process that He set up and work through those human instruments. We talked about just using the word Torah. The idea that we usually translate that word law, but that really is not a good representation of what Torah is. So when I talk about Torah, I'm not talking about the Pentateuch. Sometimes that's used for that. But I'm talking about Torah as what we might broadly call the legal type provisions that we find in books like Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. All of that's Torah. Anytime it looks like these legal type provisions of what you should do or shouldn't do and how people should conduct themselves. So it's not the narratives like we find in the first half of Exodus, but it includes things like the decalogue, what's often called the Ten Commandments. But again, as I talked about, we're going to shy away from that designation. The decalogue, the 10 words. That's part of the Torah. And the Torah is this broader type of literature that we associate too often with law. We talked about the idea that the Torah is not legislation. There was no statutory law in the ancient world. We talked about it not being a moral system or even a social system, though it plugs into some of those aspects. And speaking of the word aspect, you remember that I introduced the term aspective, which meant that it gives examples and illustrations. You know, any of you who were here the last hour, you know, Sky talked about a trellis, or we could talk about a scaffolding. And in one sense, all these legal provisions, what we're going to start calling stipulations, provide a scaffolding or a trellis. So when we say they're aspective, it means that they provide this basis for understanding the broader scope of what holiness would look like, what wisdom would look like, what justice would look like, what order would look like. Examples. But those examples serve as this kind of scaffolding. What does it mean to be faithful to the suzerain? Well, you couldn't begin to list all of the ways. But these illustrations provide a scaffolding for our thought. As Sky was talking this morning, I couldn't help but think about the idea that the Lord's Prayer itself is in some ways aspective. When it says, "Hallowed be your name," well, what are all the ways that that could happen? It's prompting you to just branch out, to think of all the ways that God's name should be hallowed, about all the ways that God's kingdom should come, about all the ways that God's will should be done. In that sense, that list that Jesus provided is aspective, but it gives a scaffolding for us to think about the things that should concern us as we pray. It might be an interesting way to think about it. And likewise, the Torah provides such a scaffolding to think about what does it mean to be God's people whom he has designated as holy. You know, the old poetic, I think it's Shakespearean line, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." And there's no end, theoretically, to the ways. But explore them, investigate them, think about them. And that's how God's relationship to his people, how a vassal's relationship to a suzerain should take place. Think of all the ways that you can be faithful to God. Think about all the ways that you can live a life of wisdom that will enhance God's honor and reputation. Don't be content with a list that you can check off. That's what I'm getting at, and I hope that came through yesterday, and I hope it'll continue to come through. When we finally get down to looking at the 10 words individually, it's the same thing. Each one of those opens a conversation. And one of the ways that I'm going to talk about that tomorrow and Thursday is remember that even on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is opening some of them up. You've heard it said, don't kill, don't murder. Well, I tell you, and see, he's opening it up. If you hate your brother, if you're angry at someone else, the whole discussion goes much further. So that's what we're talking about when we're getting to this aspective element. Does that make some sense? I mean, you're seeing how these things fit together. What we have then in the Torah, or in the decalogue, or in the Lord's Prayer, are prompts. Just like I might make notes for myself, which I did. I don't usually work from notes, but some things were going through my mind of what I wanted to remind you of, and I jotted a couple things down. They're prompts. It's not everything I want to say, but they prompt me to remember. Faithfulness to God. What he asks for from his people, faithfulness, is a never-ending quest. And we want to explore it in all the depth and detail that we possibly can, because that will make us faithful people. The holy status that God has given us. He gave Israel a holy status in their covenant. We're in a different covenant, but likewise we are called his holy people. We are identified with him. And that calls us to faithfulness in ever deepening ways. So that's what I'm getting at with this whole idea of the aspective element. And it's trying to help us move off the idea that these are laws I need to obey, my checklist I need to check off. It's too easy for us to think that way, not only when we're dealing with Torah, law in the Old Testament, but really even when we're dealing with our lives and in our churches and how we think about our responsibility before God. Our responsibility before God calls for us to explore in all its glorious depth what faithfulness looks like. So that's a little bit of a review of where we've been. Key terms. We talked about holiness, we talked about order, we talked about wisdom. And remember that wisdom is my main opposing word for legislation. That instead of thinking of Torah as legislation, law, to think of it as wisdom. Wisdom for living a life that will enhance God's reputation and honor. Now, one of the key words we're going to talk a lot about today is stipulations. Yesterday, I introduced the idea that God set up a covenant relationship. And I'll pretty much use the words covenant and treaty interchangeably. Treaty was sort of the grounding that we had in the ancient world when one king made a treaty with another king. Usually not a parity treaty, equal parties, but a suzerain and vassal treaty, which is very much like God's treaty covenant with Israel. And what characterized these treaties, several parts, but primarily the main core was the stipulations section. Now, what I'm going to propose here is that these legal provisions in the Torah, notice I'm going around the block to keep from calling them laws, because they're not. These wisdom legal provisions in the Torah and in the decalogue is 10 provisions. Wisdom, legal, more than that. Those legal provisions have been recontexted, just been given a new context. When we take words from a secular song that speak vaguely enough about love between people, and we plug it into a context of worship where we talk about love between God and his people, we're engaged in recontexting, taking something from one context, using it in another. Sometimes that can be done abusively. If someone takes a line from a politician's speech and puts it into some other context, suddenly it sounds like he's said a horrible thing. So recontexting can be abusive, but it can also be used to good effect. It happens in literature all the time. Even often when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, they are recontexting. Even when Paul talks about the law, he's not really talking about how ancient Israelites thought about Torah. He's talking about a conversation that was going on in his day, in his time, between the Pharisees and the teaching of Jesus and the followers of Jesus and the development of the church. And he was taking things from the Old Testament and recontexting them into a new discussion. So that can be done very legitimately. It happens all the time. So what I'm going to be suggesting is that these, what we might call legal provisions that we see in the Torah, are not even there as legal provisions. They're there as stipulations to the covenant. They've been recontexted. Okay, now we're going to open that up today and talk about some of that. But we're going to try to understand this concept of stipulations. Because just as the legal sayings on the Stele of Hammurabi were aspective, so stipulations in treaties are aspective. In the end, what a treaty calls for is the utter and absolute loyalty of the vassal to the suzerain. And the stipulations in those treaties give it a scaffolding. Here's some of the ways to think about that. So that's why we want to probe a little bit, because it's in the genre of treaty stipulations that we're going to have our closest comparison to what's going on in the Torah and the decalogue. I know it keeps seeming like I'm putting off the decalogue discussion, but how can we possibly study it if we haven't seen it in its cultural and literary context? And that's what we're trying to do. Yes, sir?
Just a clarification, the recontexting is taken from other ancient texts into...
No, I mean, yes, but no. That's not what I was saying, although it's not untrue. The question was, is the recontexting bringing things from other ancient texts into the Bible? And you could talk about it that way, but that's not how I'm talking about it, and that would have to be a highly qualified statement. What I'm talking about is that Israel undoubtedly had kind of legal sayings, customary law in their society, not everybody else's. In their society, legal ways of thinking, even though it wasn't statutory law. But in the Torah that we have in our Bibles, those things have been taken out of that context and put in a new literary context, a treaty covenant context. Okay, so thank you for helping me clarify that. Okay, let's go to some of the things in the PowerPoint slide. When we start dealing with this idea of covenant, again, remembering that treaty and covenant. Treaties in the ancient world weren't discussing the nature of the gods. They were discussing the relationship between the king and his vassals. Now, there were certain oaths that were connected to treaties, and they named the gods who were overseeing, the treaty relationship. But it wasn't about the gods. It was about this relationship. And in that way, when we use the idea of treaties to understand covenant, the greater significance concerns what the covenant communicates about the relationship between suzerain and vassal. To that extent, we could make the point that it's not as much about what sort of God he is, but what sort of king he is. In other words, Israelites would have recognized this form, this literary form, as a treaty. And a treaty, by its nature, defines a relationship between a king and vassal, and tells you about how to treat that suzerain as a king. Now, of course, in the Old Testament, the two mix together a lot. God is king, their king is their God, divine rule, all of these things, they all mix together. But since we are not inherently so familiar with kingship, we tend to look at the covenant and think that it's trying to dictate something about the nature of God. And it has information about the nature of God, but even then, in most cases, there's more of a focus on Yahweh as their king. It's not a big change, but it is a change in terms of what you expect to find there. Again, that it's not so much trying to give you raw theology. It's trying to give you this sense of kingship and your obligation to your divine king. But let's go back to the start of this conversation. Why does Yahweh even make a covenant with Israel? And I don't mean, why does he make it with them instead of somebody else? Well, that's God's own choice, and we're not in any position to question why God makes those kinds of decisions. But why engage his relationship with them through a covenant? What does the covenant accomplish? Now, here again, we have to try to push our own inclinations a little bit off to the side. We can never get rid of them, but just becoming aware of them and try to think outside of our own larger theological posture on things. Because of the fact that we, the church, are in a covenant with God through Christ, sealed by his blood, we tend to think of covenant in connection to salvation. Because it's through the blood of Christ that we are God's covenant people, the church. And so it's really easy for us to kind of push that paradigm back into Israel and to think that God's covenant with them was about salvation. We even would be encouraged in that kind of thinking by Paul's conversation with the Pharisees. Because there we're familiar with the question, are people saved by works of the law? Right? Or by grace through faith? And so even in the New Testament, lots of the conversation with the Torah concerns salvation. But that is the argument, the conversation of the first century AD. It's not the conversation of the Old Testament period. So the first thing we can say about God making a covenant with Israel is that it's not about salvation. God does not make a covenant with them in order to save them. They're not saved by keeping Torah. As a matter of fact, Israelites in the ancient world would not have even considered the concept of being saved from sins. They never thought of their sacrifices as saving them from sins. And of course, Hebrews comes later on and affirms that. Blood of bulls and goats can never take away sins. But he's not arguing against the ancient Israelites there, because they never would have thought that to begin with. They didn't imagine that they could be saved from sins, or that being saved from sins was even an issue. So they don't think of the covenant as some means to being saved from sins. It's just not in their frame of reference. Furthermore, and this is difficult for us to imagine, the Israelites had no concept of going to heaven when they die. They had no concept of righteous being rewarded and wicked being punished. They didn't have the idea that there were differing destinies for different people after death. Israelites would have believed that everybody, when they died, continued to exist, but the afterlife was in sort of a nondescript netherworld. No rewards or punishments. And you can see this in some of the Psalms. When the psalmist says, "Who praises you in Sheol?" Sheol is the Hebrew word there for the netherworld. God's not there. God has access to there. Other Psalms tell us that. But it's not a place of God's presence. It's not a place of worship. It's not a place where they are somehow nearer to God. It's a place where everybody goes, the realm of the dead. So likewise, covenant does not convey to them some idea of future heavenly life or eternal life. It just wasn't on their radar at all. And God had not revealed anything to them about that. So the covenant is not a means to salvation. Now it's important to move these off the table. Because again, whatever I'm saying with regard to Torah holds with regard to the decalogue. Decalogue, keeping the 10 words, has nothing to do with one's salvation. But again, the Israelites would have never thought that. They're thinking vassal treaty. They're not thinking eternal life with God. Now, as I've got up there, neither is it simply promise. Some people have, well, okay, a little tangent here. We really get off on promises. And don't get me wrong, certainly God makes promises. And we're glad that he does. And we are the beneficiaries of those promises, and we find hope in those promises. We trust him to keep his promises. But here's the thing about promises. It's too easy to think about those as benefits for us. Promises are what we get. Promises are what we love. Promises are what give us benefits. And so the danger is that when we start thinking in terms of promises, we're starting to think about ourselves instead of thinking about God. And in fact, when God comes into that equation, too often it can be, well, you promised. You promised, so you owe me. And if I can find this place where, in my view, God has promised something, well, he's accountable to me. He needs to deliver. I mean, he owes me. God's indebted to me. That's easy to make that little step. As a result, we too often go hunting through our Bibles for the promises of God, and this is even the language you use, so we can claim them. Cash it in, baby. Get all that you are owed. I know we wouldn't talk about it that way to ourselves, but boy, it so easily goes in that direction. And what I find as I look at places, books, and whatever that talk about all the promises of God, lots of them, if you look carefully in the context, aren't promises at all. There are statements about kind of the nature of God. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. You promised that you would take care of me. No, hold it. That's not a promise. That's the nature of God, to act as shepherd. A bunch of the other promises that we claim are indeed promises to Israel, not to us. Just because God made a promise to Israel, and Israel is God's people, and we also in a different way are God's people, therefore that same promise is made, nope, can't do that equation, sorry. Many of God's promises to Israel are wrapped into his particular covenant relationship with them that does not necessarily extend to his covenant relationship with us. If my people who are called by my name, oh, ouch. Sorry, did I step on your feet there? I will heal their land. Not just anybody in any land can pick that up. Land is a covenant aspect for Israel. And he's going to heal their land because they are going to be dwelling in that land where he is dwelling. The big deal with land for Israel was that they were caretakers of Yahweh's land. And it was his land because the temple was there and he was dwelling there in their midst. No other land can claim that. So we have to be careful lest we take promises made specifically to Israel connected to that covenant and just sort of extrapolate them to us. Be strong and courageous, for I will be with you. And we just pick that up and say, whatever I want to do, if I'm strong and courageous, God will be with me. No, I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. With Joshua, God can tell him, be strong and courageous, because Joshua was asked to do a very hard task, but God's saying, I have promised you, I have told you I will be with you, I've told you to do this. And so I will be with you, and therefore you can be strong and courageous. That doesn't mean that any time we feel like doing something and decide that if we're strong and courageous, that God will be with us. That's not a promise of God. Okay, so all of that was a little tangent just to bring out how we really love promises and kind of why. And that's not so good. So, because we're like that, we tend to go to the covenant and saying, God's making promises. Well, he is. He tells Abraham, I'll make you a big family. I'll take you to this land. You'll be a blessing, right? Promises. Promises to Abram and his family in their covenant. But here's the point I'm trying to get at. God did not just make promises almost arbitrarily just so he could prove he could keep them. They're not random promises just so that God can be a promise keeper. He is a promise keeper. We sang that song last night. I loved that song. Isn't the worship team incredible here? They really whip us into a frenzy. Anyway, so I love that song, and God is a promise keeper. But again, it's amazing how we can take some of the most important things about God and turn them around so suddenly it's about us. Yeah. Something to be careful of. Anyway, so I would say then that it is not for salvation or for promise. That's not why God is making a covenant with Israel. Why is he making a covenant with Israel? Two key terms here, revelation and presence. Now here I'm going back to the basic statement in Genesis 12, through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Now before that we had, I'll make you a big family, and I'll take you to a land, okay? But then all of that is for a purpose. And here, if we get a purpose statement, now we know why God's making a covenant with Israel. He didn't make a covenant just so he could have them have lots of kids. He didn't make a covenant just so he could give them a land. He's making a covenant with them because through them, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. What does that mean? Now, the first answer that probably popped into lots of your minds is Jesus. That's because we were trained well in Sunday school. You know, from when you're 2 and 3 and 4 years old, you kind of learn in Sunday school that the answer to every question the teacher asks is either Jesus, God, the Bible, or church. And it's a multiple choice kind of test. You know, you just have to figure out which one works. So for many of you, the word Jesus popped into your minds, and that's not a bad thing. It's good for the word Jesus to pop into our minds, but that doesn't mean it's the answer to every question. Certainly, don't miss this, certainly all the world is blessed because Jesus came, and Jesus came through Abraham and his family. That's true. But is that all of it? And I would suggest that no, it's not. That's a really important part of it, and I wouldn't want to miss it. Don't want to leave it out. But that's not all of it. There's other ways that the world has been blessed through Abraham and his family because of their covenant with God. One of them is revelation. All of God's revelation to us, his special revelation, not the general revelation in nature, but all of his special revelation has come through Abraham and his family. God revealed himself through Scripture, through their history, through their prophets, to the world through Abraham and his family. The covenant then became an instrument of revelation. That's important. No other people in the ancient world had this kind of revelation. All they had was divination to try to figure out what God was up to. So that's the first thing. God is in planning to communicate himself, his plans and purposes in the world through Israel. Second one might be even more important. When God created, Genesis 1 talks about how God has ordered the world, an act of creation, with purpose. What is that purpose? It becomes very clear in Genesis 1 and 2 that purpose is that he's ordered the world as a place where he is going to dwell among the people he created. God created us to be in relationship with us and to dwell among us. God with us. Emmanuel theology. It's not just a Christmas story. God created us and he ordered this world as a place where he would dwell among his people, in relationship with them. Of course, we messed that up. By Genesis 3, we decided, like any good 2-year-old, I want to do it myself. I want to order the world around me. And God says, not in my backyard, out you go, good luck with that. Stay in touch. And so they lost that access to the presence of God. The Garden of Eden was that place. And they lost that. Because they wanted to order everything for their own benefit. And of course, that's human nature, that's us. We do that. It's our story. So how then would God bring about this reestablishment of his presence? How's he going to do it? People at the Tower of Babel tried, build a tower. God can come down. He can dwell among us. And that sounds good if that's what God always wanted. But the problem was, there they were inviting God down into this sacred space that they wanted to create. But unfortunately, the problem was they were doing it to make their own name. It's still about them, still about us. Instead of what sacred space is supposed to be, making God's name great, exalting his name and honor. So they were doing the right thing, God among us, for the wrong reasons, so we can benefit. And too often, of course, that's the true nature of most religions in the world, and too often it's true about Christianity as well. It's all about our own name. It's all about our benefit instead of being about God. And that's why we lapse into what I call transactionalism. I do for God, God does for me. I take care of God, God takes care of me. And lots of our prayers, unfortunately, go that direction, as Sky's been talking about. We think all about results and about ourselves. And even our prayers focus on what's in it for me. Let's get me going straight here. It reflects a deeply inherent transactionalism that we too often associate with what our Christianity is, as if it's somehow all about us. We can even make that mistake when we focus too strongly on our salvation. I'm saved and going to heaven. That's great that we are. But shouldn't that be more about, I'm in Christ? I am crucified with Christ. I've died. He lives. The covenant then, and I actually said this in that clip from the film series yesterday, the covenant is on the marquee of God's plans and purposes for the world. To dwell with his people and to be in relationship with them. The covenant's a big deal. That's why the TV series is going to be called The Covenant. That's the big deal. So God makes a covenant with Israel to enter into relationship, covenant, treaty, vassal suzerain, relationship. God makes a covenant to enter into a relationship, and that relationship is going to eventuate in the restoration of his presence among his people. He's coming back to earth. And I don't just mean Jesus' return. That's all part of that. Remember in the upper room, Jesus says to his disciples, I'm going away. John 14 this is. They say, oh no, it's just like Eden all over again. God, we lose access to God's presence. He says, oh, not so fast. Number one, I'm sending the Comforter. Peter says, is that a blanket? No, he didn't. But I'm sending the Comforter so you will have divine presence with you. But more importantly even than that, if there's something more important than that, more importantly, I'm going to prepare a place for you so that where I am, you will be. Divine presence. So the Holy Spirit, of course, comes at Pentecost, and that's God's presence now, not just living among us, Israel, the temple, not just walking around among us, Jesus incarnate, but now within us, God's presence. This is all the covenant story. God's covenant is to establish relationship and presence. And that means that the big part of God's covenant is not the 10 words, is not even the Torah, it's the temple, the tabernacle. You notice half the book of Exodus is about instructions for the tabernacle. They build the tabernacle at Sinai. God comes down to Sinai and says, here's the Torah, which will help you to live an ordered life in my presence. Because I'm coming back. And here's all the instructions for the tabernacle. And we zing through that. Boy, when you're doing the reading through the Bible in a year, don't you hate it when you get to those last chapters in Exodus and it overwhelms you? Why so much space for it? This is preparing for God's presence to come and return to earth. I can just picture Moses the night before they dedicate the tabernacle. It's all built, instructions given by God. There it is. I can just picture him. I'm making this up, but I can just picture him, active imagination that I have, gathering together the elders, maybe lots of the people, and saying, do you realize the moment at which we stand? God, who created us to be in relationship with us, who created us to dwell among us, and what we blew back at the Garden of Eden, tomorrow, he's coming back right here. We haven't seen this moment since the beginning of our history. God returning to dwell among us. The covenant is set up for God's presence. Why did God make a covenant with Israel? I hope I've given you some good ideas. But alas, I'm only on slide 3 of 18. Okay. Oh my. So this is this connection between the covenant and the tabernacle. Don't miss it. The big thing that happens at Sinai is the tabernacle. Not the booming thunder from the mountain. That was cool. I mean, great sound of the light show. God speaking from the mountain was a big deal. But he's speaking from the mountain because he's preparing to make his way down. So the Torah is intimately related to the covenant as stipulations and to the tabernacle as the reason for it all. How do you live in the midst, in the neighborhood of a holy God? And God says, I've embraced you into my holiness. I've enfolded you into my identity. You belong here. And I'm going to tell you how you can conduct yourselves to reflect who you are, your identity in the Creator God of the heavens and the earth. So, unfortunately, we treat the Torah reductionistically if we think of it just to establish legislation or to establish a moral system or to establish a systematic theology. It's not that it has no role to play in any of that, less or more, but we're reductionistic if we say, and that's what it is, because it's more than that. It has to do with the divine king who's dwelling among them. Think about how Catholic communities act when they hear the Pope is coming for a visit. Wow, is that a big deal? I mean, not quite as big as it's much bigger than when a president is going to visit a community and talk. When somebody important is coming, it's really, really a big deal. But what if the Pope said to this Catholic community, you know what? I'm going to live in your community. I'm going to live here. Okay? People at the Vatican would be very disappointed about that, but wouldn't that be a big deal? And that's what's going on here. Their divine king is coming to live among them. And they want to do everything just right. That's what Torah is about. How can we reflect that we are his people? So, faithfulness to the covenant is the same thing. It equals loyalty to the divine king. And that's the pattern that we get. So Israel is being the host to the divine presence. Think about Zacchaeus when Jesus calls him down out of the tree and says, I'm going to your house today. Whoa! Zoom! Wants to go and get everything ready just right. I'm going to your house today. And for Israel, the covenant is not just I'm going to your house, I'm going to live among you. This is more fun than cuneiform. I'll even say that, okay? But we had to do that to do this, all right? So, when we talk about these covenant stipulations, getting back to our task here, again, we've noted that they are aspective. By now you're used to that word. They are instruction in wisdom to properly serve as royal vassal. You need wisdom to know what to do. How do you prepare for some important person that's coming to visit your house or your church? There's a certain amount of wisdom of what are all the things you do? What's the best way to reflect the honor you want to give to this person? And it might mean cleaning house. It might mean getting fresh flowers all around. It might mean making sure all the china's, making sure the food's all right. All kinds of preparations you do. Think of anything. Be creative. So the instruction in wisdom guides those processes as well as custom. Okay? There's no law that says you have to have fresh flowers, but that's sort of one customary thing you can do. So they're going to be royal vassals. It delineates a relationship by circumscribing and describing. We talked about that idea yesterday. Aspective lists circumscribe and describe. They're not exhaustive. Again, scaffolding, a trellis, these are good words to help us understand how they give shape to this larger commitment. So it's not a comprehensive list of everything expected of a vassal. The ancient treaties are not that way. You're expected as a vassal to be creative in all the many ways that you can be loyal to the king. So like treaties, the covenant gives examples of what faithfulness to a suzerain would look like. The Torah itself are these examples. The decalogue is a smaller aspective list of examples. And you notice when Jesus is asked, what's the essence of the law? He narrows it down even to a shorter aspective list. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Wow, is that all we have to do? No, what you have to do is to be faithful to God in every possible way. And these are prompts, an aspective list. You want some scaffolding to think about what God asks of you? Start with these. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Start there. It's a good place to start. But it's so much more. It's everything. Everything. And you can spend your lifetime trying to figure out what are all the ways to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. You can spend your lifetime trying to think of the ways that you can love your neighbor as yourself. And it's never that you can get to the point and just check it off, done that. It's not that way. So why should we think of Torah differently? God takes Israel as his covenant people. He declares them holy. He gives them that status. He's going to dwell among them and work through them so that all the world will be blessed through them, through Abraham's family. He's taking a vassal in Israel because that enhances his own reputation. Now, if we said, I'm doing this to enhance my reputation, you would say, well, that's kind of arrogant or, whatever. But, there's no limits on God. God's reputation deserves to be enhanced in every possible way. Again, to say it the way we're more used to saying it in Christian circles, we want to bring honor to his name. And he is worthy. He deserves every bit of it and more. God has taken a vassal, Israel, not to try to give them sort of some special treatment, although he does give them special status. But this is so his name might be known. When Israel is a light to the nations, it doesn't mean they're going door to door with 4 spiritual laws tracts, knocking on doors and trying to lead people to Yahweh. They are a light to the nations because they are supposed to be reflecting his honor so that others will see it, the light on a hill of the Sermon on the Mount, and come flocking. So, when we talk about general treaty expectations, this is just to give you some quick examples. These next couple slides go very quickly. Okay? So, some of the things we see in treaties. I'm going back to the ancient Near East here. I'm reading treaties. Yeah, it's what I do. Okay? So, reading them to try to understand how that can help us. So, the idea that they acknowledge only the suzerain as their master. That's just like God saying, I'm the only God that you're allowed to pay any attention to. That's a suzerain vassal deal. They're supposed to love the suzerain as they love themselves. That's in these treaties. Sound familiar, right? Faithfulness to the suzerain by, for instance, not making alliances against him, not joining revolts against him, not cursing him. And again, these are the same kinds of things that you might find in the Torah. Unfaithfulness will result in forfeiture of land. That's in these treaties. If you're a vassal to the king and you renege on your faithfulness, the king has given you some land rights and he's going to take them away. Part of vassal treaties, part of the covenant. Acknowledged allegiance or submission. The suzerain expects you to admit your vassal status, and you're supposed to be happy about it. A content vassal of the suzerain. The suzerain promises protection to the vassal. That's part of the deal. Find the same thing in the covenant. The vassal is not supposed to covet land or inhabitants of other allied vassals. Not speaking evil against the suzerain and punishing those who do. Respectful treatment and display of the image or the stele of the suzerain. These are all things that we find in ancient Near Eastern treaties and that, again, we also see are parts of the covenant. We can see that there are specific treaty expectations. water management and rights, establishment of boundaries, provision of troops. I'm going through these very, very quickly. You can see them all: payment of tribute, tariff restrictions, restitution for theft, treatment of envoys. There are very specific elements. And again, in the covenant, in the Torah, we find very specific stipulations. You recognize them when you run into them. You're supposed to wear tassels on the edge of your garments. That's pretty specific. Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, right? Some very specific things. And these treaties have those, okay, as examples of how the vassal will react to the suzerain. But then, perhaps more importantly for our decalogue discussion, there are open-ended and undefined aspects. Totally devote your heart to the suzerain. Well, what's that mean? Be creative. Think of everything. There shall be no wrongdoing. Kind of open-ended, right? You will not commit offense or violence. See, now we're no longer talking about the legal collections like Hammurabi Stele. We're talking about the treaties and the stipulations. And remember, in the Old Testament, legal provisions, like we find in Hammurabi, have been recontexted into covenant stipulations. By the way, that's not unusual in the ancient world either. The Hammurabi Stele itself, I know you were dying to know this, is a recontexting. Because Hammurabi has used those legal provisions and brought them over into a propaganda document, a legitimation document. Remember, he's standing before the god saying, these are all the great things I've done. You know, he's recontexted it now into his annual report, so to speak. You will do nothing against the suzerain. Well, what are some things that are against the suzerain? Yeah, err on the, suzerain side. Do nothing bad. I've drawn these lines out of the treaties so you can get an idea how aspective they are, how prompting they're supposed to be, how they serve as a scaffolding. Don't sin in any way. Do not neglect the support of the suzerain in any way. You should have no unfavorable thought toward the suzerain. Wow. This asks for a lot. Yeah. That affects every part of life. Do not do anything that is not good. What all of this demonstrates, the reason why I'm giving you this list is because I really think you need to read the ancient Near Eastern. No, the reason I'm giving you this list is because it helps us to understand the nature of stipulations in a treaty. And it demonstrates that more is expected than any list could possibly delineate. That's the point. And we have to understand that about Torah, and we have to understand that about the Decalogue. Now, what I've done here is I've taken the structure of the Decalogue and I've pulled statements out of the treaties from the ancient Near East. Don't have any other suzerain, the treaties say. Sounds a lot like, don't have any other gods before me. Respect the image of the suzerain. Decalogue says you shouldn't make any images of me. I've already made the image of me. It's you. Don't speak evilly of the suzerain, and do not hold guiltless those who do. Exactly the kind of wording in the third word of the Decalogue. The fourth word of the Decalogue concerns the Sabbath, and there is nothing comparable. We'll talk about that some tomorrow. Give honor to the suzerain that your days may be long in your land. In the decalogue we have, honor your parents, your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land. Lest there be any mistake on this, I'm not suggesting that the Israelites borrowed something from the treaties. I'm not suggesting that somehow Moses got a hold of a treaty between whoever and said, ooh, that's good, that's good. Ooh, that's really good. Do I have to use a footnote? Okay, we're not talking about indebtedness. We're talking about embeddedness. Anybody in the ancient world is part of the cultural river. They know these are the ways that you honor a suzerain. And the Israelites knew it. They didn't have to read an ancient treaty. This is how you act toward a suzerain. Don't commit murder against any of the people of the suzerain. That's in these treaties. Do not engage in sexual behavior with any of the suzerain's family. Do not steal what belongs to the suzerain. Now, some of these look a little more specific, stealing what belongs to the suzerain instead of stealing anything. We'll get to those when we talk about the decalogue. Do not swear falsely, that is, violate an oath made to the suzerain. They swore an oath when this treaty was made, and the Israelites did too when the covenant was made. Do not swear falsely. And finally, do not covet what belongs to the suzerain. Now, in a vassal treaty, that means don't think you can take your city back as your own. It's mine, says the suzerain. Can't do that. Don't think you can try to take control of your neighboring country's land. That belongs to the suzerain. You can't have that. Coveting what belongs to the suzerain. Now again, these are all in relationship to the suzerain, not just in relationship to other people. But we're going to talk about the whole idea of the decalogue being focused on the Israelite community. And if you covet something that belongs to your Israelite neighbor, you're violating something that belongs to someone who belongs to the suzerain, another vassal, so to speak. We'll get more into that tomorrow. So on this section, don't get fooled by that word conclusion. We still are halfway through the slideshow. Okay? Conclusion, the covenant helps Israel to understand how they are to relate to Yahweh. Notice relationship. How they are to relate to Yahweh as their divine king. It's not trying to offer metaphysical revelation about him as God. Okay? So it's not so much systematic theology. It's almost like this political-like relationship. Okay, we better move on. Very important for us to understand today. The covenant between God and Israel, and therefore the Torah, okay, remember, decalogue is part of the Torah. Torah is the stipulations for the covenant. All right? So we're working with that understanding. We have to understand the contexts of the Torah and the covenant, because we don't want to take them out of context to try to interpret them. The first context is one we've talked about somewhat already. It's ancient world. But that means that when the Torah talks about wisdom to achieve order, that concept of order is within the context of the ancient world. What constituted order for them may at times be different from the order that we would think important. Cultures are different. For them, having a king brought order. We wouldn't think of it that way. Our typical democratic view of kingship is very negative. That brings chaos. That brings tyranny. That brings oppression. That's not order. So this is in the context of the ancient world. Sometimes we read the Torah and we say, boy, that seems a little tough on women. God is speaking into an ancient world context where a hierarchical structure, men, women, children, brings order, not insult. For them, it's represented order, that there was a hierarchical structure that everyone honored and lived within. It's order for them, not misogyny. Our concepts of order today are not ancient world concepts. But God was working in a culture. And this was to bring his name honor in that culture. And we shouldn't judge it by our own standards of order. God wasn't conforming what he said to everyone's standard of order in every age, in every place. How could you do that? So it is situated in the context of the ancient world. Secondly, it is situated in the context of the covenant between Yahweh and Israel. The Canaanites were not expected to somehow live by the decalogue or by the Torah. God never rebukes the Canaanites or the Babylonians or the Egyptians for using idols. He just says, that's not how I want you as my people to work. He doesn't say we're going to wipe out the Canaanites because they use idols. He doesn't even tell the Israelites that the Babylonians or the Assyrians are horrible because of their many gods. He just says they don't do them much good. So the Torah is situated in this context, God and Israel. Now, that not only means, as I've said, that it doesn't apply to people outside of Israel in time, it also doesn't apply to people outside Israel through time. We are not a party to this covenant. We are not the vassals that this covenant is speaking about. This Torah is not to us, you know it's coming next, even though it is in some senses for us. It's not to us because it's not a covenant with us. It's for us because it has become part of Scripture. And we have to figure out what the difference is between that to us and for us part. So when you read about tassels on your garments, not cutting the side curls, this is not for you.
Amen.
Yeah. But some people hear me say that or read when I say that, and they say, oh, so you're saying that the Old Testament is no good for us anymore, that we ought to unhitch ourselves from the Old Testament, it's not relevant. I didn't say that. Just don't make the mistake of thinking that it's your covenant. Get your hands off that covenant. It doesn't belong to you. Okay? Again, we're going to have to figure out then, how does it work as Scripture? If it's not our covenant, how does it work as Scripture? That's my teaser for the next couple days, okay? So, context of the ancient world. Context of the covenant between Yahweh and Israel. Context of the presence of Yahweh. This is how Israel is to conduct itself, wisdom, holiness, order, in the presence of God. How do you live when God is in your midst? How are you going to bring honor to his name. So Torah is not just free-floating out there, here's some things that you ought to do. Torah is not free-floating, it's linked to God's presence. It's examples of forms that cultic and social order would take to bring honor to Yahweh's reputation and his holiness in their world. In their world. People get upset when they read the Torah. They often don't know to call it that, but when they're reading the Old Testament and they see that it talks about how slaves are to be treated. And they get all up in arms because they say, how can you worship a God who endorses slavery? And it's the most incongruous thing they can think of. Why would you link yourself to this Bible that endorses slavery? Well, it helps to understand that God, when he gave the Torah, was not setting up an ideal society. He wasn't trying to say this is ideal in every way and this is how you should conduct. Every people in every place, in every culture ought to set up their society this way. That's not what Torah is. It's a covenant with Israel in the ancient world who's living in the presence of Yahweh, who's in the tabernacle and temple. It can help us to start to understand wisdom and holiness, but not through some kind of checklist approach. So if we try to shift our thinking from a contextual sense of order instead of a universal moral legislation, that'll be helpful. Think for a minute about Robert's Rules of Order. Right? It's what lots of organizations use. That's why people say, I move such and such, and I second the motion, and we have to have a majority vote. And many of you are familiar with Robert's Rules. You're in organizations, sometimes even your churches or your businesses that tend to use it. Robert's Rules of Order. So, if we think about rules for order instead of laws of society, that's a good step to make. After all, Robert's Rules, an organization decides that they want to conduct themselves by those rules, as relative as they are. I mean, these are not in stone. They're not laws. It's just, this is a way that you can maintain order in a large group that's trying to make decisions, and it works. You might find that other cultures, maybe something in South America or something in Asia or something in Eastern Europe, maybe it wouldn't work so well for them. But it works in our kinds of contexts. It's not perfect. It's kind of relative to sort of our culture. But it results in orderly conversation, decision-making. Robert's Rules of Order, just as an example. And think also of when we think about wisdom. Think about safety wisdom. Okay, this is a list I took a photocopy of, or just a camera. Okay, safety is everyone's responsibility. All right, be safe. That's not a command. It's an imperative, but it's not a command. Right? That's an exhortation. And so here's again a whole list of imperatives. These are not laws. They are not obligatory in terms of law, but they carry some obligation for wisdom if you want to be safe. Do you want to be safe? These are some of the things that you should do. This is aspective, right? It's not comprehensive. Gives you a scaffolding, how to think about safety. I don't think I need to dwell on it. You can see the point very clearly. Wisdom for, here, safety. Wisdom with a purpose in mind. Wisdom for establishing order. It's not legislation, but yet in wisdom it must be heeded. Remember the difference between heeding and obeying. Obeying reduces it to a command. Heeding expands it to wisdom. So, Torah offers Israel wisdom, not legislation, not a moral system, not a universal social system. Torah offers Israel wisdom to guide them in forging an identity so they can be light to the nations, reflecting the glory of their God. An identity that correlates with the holy status that they were given when they were designated the people of God. See, we can't even begin interpreting the decalogue till we understand Torah. That's why I've taken all the time to do this. So, everybody knows that when we look at Torah, there are some things that aren't sensible at all for us to keep. Tassels on garments, for instance. Okay, we could do that, but offering sacrifices at the temple. There is no temple, and even the idea of sacrificing an animal doesn't fit very well in the sense of order today, right? But Israel was supposed to do it. That didn't mean that all people of all time were supposed to sacrifice animals. That fits in the ancient world for how God was respected. So some people have solved that in the past, throughout church history, of saying, okay, the law, the Torah is in three categories. Civil law, kind of society and how it works. Ritual law, all the practices at the temple. And moral law. And they say, the civil law, that was Israel, that's not us, bye. Ritual law, we have no temple, Jesus did all of that, bye. And so we're left with the moral law, and this is what every good believer, person of God needs to do. Well, that's a good attempt to try to weed through it, but it's not really a valid attempt because Israel had no such differentiation. For Israel, it's all Torah. And as Torah, it's all doing the same thing. And if we try to set up a threefold system just so we can sort it out for our criteria, we're making it up. We're deciding which things are moral and which things are not. And it ends up then being our system, not God's system. Even though we kind of dragged it out of the Bible kicking and screaming. So the threefold division is unproductive. Again, as I mentioned, it does not reflect an ideal society. So God is not endorsing slavery as a legitimate institution. God is not endorsing monarchy as a legitimate institution. God is not endorsing arranged marriages as the way marriage has to be. God is not endorsing a status difference between men and women. We can't read the Torah that way. It's not rules of a moral system. It has implications for our moral conversations. Don't miss that. It does. It has implications. But implications means we've got some important steps to take before we can get there. We're quickly running out of time. I think that I'm going to skip this slide. Again, the role of ritual basically is tribute to their king. Malachi makes that connection. Would you bring these lame and blind animals to your governor? Of course you wouldn't. Tribute to your governor, tribute to your suzerain. Okay, it wasn't supposed to work. It wasn't the idea that ancient world, great symbiosis, means that we take care of God, God takes care of us. You take care of God by meeting his needs, feed him, clothe him, house him. In the ancient world, they believed gods had those needs. Israel, God makes a cut in that and says, nope, I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. If I were hungry, I wouldn't ask you. And so these sacrifices that you're bringing are not my food. This temple is not my essential housing. Don't think of me that way. But it's interesting, he still has them bring sacrifices. They're doing the same looking thing, but being given a different reasoning behind it. This is not my food, he says. This is your tribute to bring honor to me. Okay, we could talk a lot more about that, but we don't have time. Sacrifices, I like to call them relationship building exercises, right? You bring a gift to someone who's meaningful to you, that's helping build that relationship. And so Israel brings gifts. God's worthy of those gifts. And it's a way for them to express his worthiness. So all of that, the objective is divine favor. Not because he's in some way capricious or, kind of drifts away, but that's what he deserves. So, aspective, instruction in wisdom, delineate relationships, not a comprehensive list. We've covered all of that. Holiness we've covered, that's good. Okay, so we've got all of this and have talked about the idea of identifying with Yahweh. So these are all the pieces we're trying to fit together. Now, how's this going to lead us to decalogue? Again, tomorrow we're going to actually start into the decalogue. So this is just the foundation. Again, we can't start by assuming it's the summary of a moral system. We're going to eventually have to talk about what its implications for morality are, but it's not given as a moral system. We also recognize that the Decalogue has different reflections. In Exodus 34, 12 through 28, that section is called the 10 words. And it's a totally different set than what we find in Exodus 20 or Deuteronomy 5, and it has ritual in it. Interesting. You can jot it down and look at it. I was going to read it if we had time, but we don't. Okay, and so we have to think about both similarities and differences from all of these things we've talked about in the ancient world. We're going to have to think in terms of community identity. God is making this covenant and giving this Torah to a community with which he is in relationship. What are the implications of that for reading the Decalogue? Last slide. We're actually going to make it, I think. Okay? So the function of the Decalogue, and again, this is just set up for our next couple days. It directs Israel as to the order that will reflect the reputation Yahweh desires to present. It gives shape to the covenant community. It's how Israel retains Yahweh's favor and how they have life in the land. Remember, if they violate it, if they are not honoring his name, then he's going to remove their guardianship of the land. These are things that Yahweh has a right to expect of his vassals. In the ancient world context, these are the kinds of things that delineate the role between the suzerain and the vassal. And Israel would have recognized that these are things that he does have a right to expect of his vassal people. You can see then that it's the suzerain vassal model which gives us an introduction into this cultural river. And we have to understand it there before we can bring it out to our own contexts. We have to understand it in terms of those to whom it was written. We have to start there. Then we can start to think about what it means for us. Okay, so that's how we're trying to work through it. It's exactly 12 o'clock. If you have questions, I'll be hanging around up here and you can come and ask them. Thank you very much. You've been very attentive, and I'll see you tomorrow.